At the start of the year, I made a video about how this is going to be a great year for horror games, but my big focus there was on the biggest games coming out in the year, your Resident Evil 4s, Dead Spaces, and Silent Hill 2s. But in reality, a lot of the best horror games of the last few years have come from the indie scene. And I'm not talking indie like 15 to 20 people funded by a big studio indie. I mean 1 or 2 people just hoping this thing they care about gets appreciated. Games like Signalis, Save the Princess, and Dead Letters Department are all games I love, even though 2 of them have yet to even release. I've reached out to a bunch of small devs working on projects that I really love the look of so that I can bring them to you and we can all eagerly await their release. I asked some of the devs some questions to shed some light on their games, right from the horse's mouth. I don't want to muddy what they said to me, so I'm just going to read their answers verbatim. Here we go. First up is the Labyrinthine They Speak from the Abyss, about which the devs say, They Speak from the Abyss is a first-person dungeon crawler RPG through the depths of a decaying world filled with tortured souls. They're mostly excited for people to see the grotesque art they painstakingly crafted. They're trying their best to make the game ooze with atmosphere. The art of They Speak from the Abyss was heavily influenced by the works of Junji Ito and Clive Barker. There are so many other influences, but those 2 are the main ones that they could name off the top of their heads, and honestly, I can see it. Next up is DARKWEB Streamer, and the dev says it's a psychological horror game about being a streamer in the 90s dark web. Completely procedurally generated and designed for infinite playthroughs, the game creates a new stories just for you every time, with brand new characters, events, hauntings, and even a whole new internet. Your job is to become the #1 streamer or die trying. They're most excited for people to see their new approach to new emergent narrative storytelling. They create intimate experiences with generated story arcs and recurring themes unique to your playthrough despite the game's random nature. They've designed their own AI that makes all our characters unique and allows them to live their own lives alongside the players. And of course they have first of its kind Twitch integration, allowing stream viewers to roleplay in the game in real time. It's such a cool concept. The creator is an anthropologist who specializes in identity theory and digital culture, and they also have an English degree and a background in AI. So the game is really a big mishmash of their interests for creating characters that feel real by being designed in accordance with social theory. They grew up in the early internet and have been fascinated by the evolution of online culture, particularly darker subcultures, so exploring that was an exciting idea. Finally, the actual idea came to them when they finished watching a movie called Dybbuk Box, the story of Chris Chambers. It explores the phenomenon of dark web unboxings, and they thought it was genius, and here we are. The next game is RETROSPACE, and the dev says, RETROSPACE is a disco punk space horror FPS with immersive elements, satirical humor, and some quite unique genre-bending features. All of this in the spirit of a never-existed underground game from the late 90s or early 2000s, with the style of the sci-fi movies of the 60s and 70s. The opponents will all be unique and different with completely distinct behaviors, and they will also mutate into various new forms, so the devs are most excited about people seeing them. And of course, it will be fascinating to see what tactics and mutations and tech upgrades players use against them and what combinations they use them in. After all, freedom and free experimentation are core philosophies of this game. For inspiration, they wanted to highlight the works of writers such as Philip K. Dick and Ray Bradbury, films such as 2001: A Space Odyssey and Logan's Run, but also more modern works such as Event Horizon and John Carpenter's The Thing. They wanted to create a mixed world where pulp sci-fi and hard science fiction could coexist perfectly, where satirical, dark humor could also find a good breeding ground. They wanted to achieve this by creating a location, Aurora 5, which is a space station in the game, whose every room is unique and memorable, and whose world exudes a very strong and distinctive atmosphere. Whilst gameplay-wise it's more of a System Shock 2, world-building-wise, they were inspired by games like Thief and, of course, BioShock. And the dev of our next game, Labyrinth of the Demon King, says it's a first-person survival horror game set in a world inspired by the legends of ancient Japan. It has the gameplay of King's Field / Onimusha, aesthetics of Silent Hill / Fatal Frame, and combat from Condemned: Criminal Origins. They're most excited for players to be able to explore the world they've created and interact with all the characters and monsters in the game. Hopefully they'll also learn a bit about yokai and some Buddhist lore too. The main inspiration would be the legend of Minamoto no Yorimitsu and his quest to slay Shuten Doji. The story has changed a lot, but anyone who knows the legend will definitely see similarities whilst playing. They've also got a big book of depictions of Buddhist hell from old Japanese artists, and the lore and such around that, which has inspired large parts of the game, mainly puzzles and some of the character designs. Also, a book on yokai helped them when coming up with new characters and monsters to add. The dev on Tower of Tears says, "The Tower of Tears is a third-person survival horror with light dungeon-crawling elements. It takes place in a mysterious and hostile large tower. You are not alone over here, and you have to choose who you want to save along the way. You'll find many useful tools to experiment, fight, and explore your way out of the tower with." The dev is in the process of creating a large cast of strange, unpredictable characters, and making them both charming and frightening in their own ways. They're also making this tower interesting to explore, with a lot of interconnected places and a lot of hidden or obscured places. The game is Animal Crossing meets Yume Nikki meets Corpse Party meets Resident Evil. They can't wait for people to dive into the atmosphere they're trying to create and seeing them toy around with the many fun toys they're building to interact with this world. They hope to make it pretty open-ended, still within a rather small scope of course, but it is just one person working on the project. A couple of Haunted PS1 demo discs ago, there was a game that really stood out to me, HEARTWORM, so I wanted to reach out to the dev of that and see if I could get some more information. The game is a survival horror game wrapped in a suburban gothic mystery, a journey about dealing and living with loss. Your weapons are a camera and your memories. They want the atmosphere and the story to be the most engaging parts. They hope it resonates with and excites players who are looking to play it. And for them, an absolute best case scenario is that maybe it helps someone out in some way. Outside of obvious game influences, a lot of photography inspired them for this game as well. Artists like Gregory Crewdson and Todd Hido. Music too. They love instrumental music and the feelings you can evoke without saying anything at all. They wanted to translate that into their game. They also love movies, as do I, and they wanted to create something that would feel as weird but accessible as something like Donnie Darko. So take that however you will. When I asked about Elation for the Wonderbox 6000, the dev said, "Elation for the Wonderbox 6000 is a narrative adventure game about going into the city and finding a game from your youth that nobody remembers. It's inspired by PS2 era Japanese adventure games and that part in JRPGs where you go into town." They would say that either some of the locations they haven't been showing off in the footage that we're probably showing on screen right now, they hope are going to be impressive and a nice surprise for players. In general, the direction the narrative goes is something they're excited for people to see, but they'll have to wait and play it to find out what that is. One thing I wanted to ask about specifically with this game is about what is clearly claymation. Is it real claymation or was it made in Blender? Turns out it was real. Every model is photographed from 8 angles for every frame of animation in the game. Every character takes about 2 days of work from modeling, photographing, cleaning up the photographs, and then inputting them into Unity. Another game from a previous Haunted PS1 demo disc is LORN'S. The devs say that LORN'S is an atmospheric narrative first-person platformer with novel climb-anything mechanics and modernized retro 3D graphics. Play as an android that's lost in a seemingly endless megastructure whilst following a glitch in its visual system. They're especially excited for people to check out the level design of the game. It's very abstract and very unique. They fought hard not to make invisible walls or clear, painted boundaries, so it should give you the itch to explore. They're very happy with how a lot of these areas turned out. I wanted to ask about how crazy some of this level design gets and if the players are going to have to pull off some pretty wild things, and the dev said, of course, you can get upgrades as you progress. Craziest would be when you get the grapple hook in the late game, which I can't wait for. The developer of Chasing Static from 2022 is now working on HOLLOWBODY, and says that HOLLOWBODY is a tech-noir survival horror short story framed in a dystopian, near-future take on modern society. Built on a love for classic horror games from the early 2000s, with a focus on narrative and exploration, you play as Micah, a black market delivery driver who finds herself stranded in a long-abandoned British city. Alone, stranded, with limited resources at your disposal, you'll have to push your way through the zone, solve environmental puzzles, manage resources, and fight for your life as you try to find a way to escape beyond the wall. With HOLLOWBODY, a great deal of care is being taken to engage the player in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Headwear Games are excited for players to immerse themselves in the long-abandoned homes of city residents, unraveling the mystery of the city through the remnants of those who once lived there. The game has an intentionally slow pace, allowing players to soak in the immersive soundscape, whilst cautious of what horrors could be lurking around every corner. This is very much a classic survival horror experience, albeit one with a larger focus on narrative than that of combat. You can still whack walking flesh sacks with a stick though. For HOLLOWBODY, they wanted to ramp things up when compared with Chasing Static. They took elements from that game which resonated with players and have built upon them. Chasing Static garnered a lot of praise for its narrative and its atmosphere, so naturally, with HOLLOWBODY this is also at the forefront, but they've been steering away from some of the more repetitive elements of Chasing Static. There is less backtracking in HOLLOWBODY, and the environments are a lot more densely packed with interesting spaces and details for players to investigate. On top of this, HOLLOWBODY adds the ever-looming fear of death, with grotesque monsters lurking in the shadows and limited resources to defend yourself. They think they found a good balance here and are excited to see how it hits with players. Finally, I wanted to add in something of an honorable mention. This is a game that technically isn't a horror game, but the gameplay and presentation stood out to me so much I had to find an excuse to contact the dev. So here's what the dev of GOSSAMER Matrix had to say. It's a first-person shooter focusing on equipment interaction. The movement and shooting mechanics take after those classic arcade and retro games, and it's a perfect simulation of the modern workplace. The devs are very excited for people to see the physics-based inventory. They made it clear that they're very proud of it, and it's the original idea that spawned the entire game. The reloading was heavily inspired by Receiver and Cruelty Squad. They wanted to have Receiver's intricacy with Cruelty Squad's gestural mouse reloading. From there, they figured it would be fun to make every interaction have something to do with moving the mouse around, and they messed with 2D physics a lot for fun. It didn't take much experimenting because they wanted it to be very basic. The combat and level design are mostly influenced by the rush of Hotline Miami and the more methodical GoldenEye. If you made it this far through the video, I hope you've enjoyed this really close look at some upcoming indie horror titles. I know I have. Be sure to tell me about games you're looking forward to that are worth checking out, and whilst you're down in the comments, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the PC Gamer channel.